Today we're going to be looking at 4 main topics. Obviously this is focused on Visual Studio 2019. We're not going to limit that to one particular version of 2019. We're going to sort of do a full look at a bunch of different features. Then you're going to be stuck with the likes of me. My name is Michaelis, and I'm not sure what else to say about me. I'm an MVP for Microsoft and an RD as well, and I'm also been at IntelliTect now for whatever, 10 years or so. And I've got a bunch of stuff related to Microsoft. As I say, I did write the Essential C# 7 book, which I know Richard has got a copy of. And I'm working on Essential C# 8 right now. So that's something that in the last week, I sort of averaged around 4 or 5 hours a night. I'm trying to get that knocked out and done and into the publisher's hands in November, with the hopes that it'll get out sometime early January timeframe is where we're at. We've got a bunch of people on the team that are helping do reviews and edits and things like that. So, jumping right into Visual Studio. So you guys are familiar with Visual Studio already with 2019. And I would say that probably the most interesting thing that you notice right up front is the amount of refactoring you get in Visual Studio 2019. We've had this, for those of us who have sort of been devotees of ReSharper, this is the first time I've heard people who are absolute addicts to ReSharper sort of tried to sort of wonder, okay, is this a time to sort of step off the ledge and actually take a risk without a parachute and rely only on Visual Studio? And it's mostly around refactoring. And there's still some ReSharper features, right? If you want to have an automatic implementation, just generate an equality override or something like that. That's not in Visual Studio yet. But if you want to, but there are a whole bunch of features that are. So we're going to look at a bunch of some of those to start. If I go to Visual Studio, and I just threw in some sample code. It's intended to not be correct, but just give you an idea of some of the things that you could go do. You'll notice to start out, there's these stars on the method names when you do a dot to go find out what members are available on the class. And some of them sort of appear at the top. And what's most interesting about the feature is not only that it obviously is deciding, okay, which ones we should use and which ones we should put at the top versus at the bottom, but how it actually determines which ones should go at the top. Does anyone know how it's making a calculation about what should be installed and what should not? Kelly, you don't count. Magic elves. Okay, that is a good answer. I take that. Magic elves is one proposal. Sean, you think magic elves too? No. Oh, okay. What's?
It's scanning through all your code and using machine learning to figure out which.
Yeah. So you both of the things you said are correct. It is using machine learning and it is doing scanning through your code, but it's not limited to your code. It turns out that Microsoft bought this company. You probably never heard of them. It's called GitHub. You guys aware of this? Anyway, so they bought GitHub, and it turns out that GitHub does a really good job of storing code. It's quite remarkable. It's a source control system, and it turns out there's a lot of code in GitHub. And so they've actually gone through and churned through the source code in GitHub and sort of figured out, hey, what are the most popular members there? And they combine the data that they're gathering out of GitHub with your own data, and they get those two together, and then they do some machine learning, and they change what's actually appearing based on the utilization factors that's showing up there. So we just use it. We don't really think about that stuff, and we shouldn't have to. But it's interesting to know that we're starting to see things like machine learning take a role in here. If I was to forecast where this is going, I imagine, and I know of at least 2 teams, both at Facebook and at Microsoft, they're trying to look at data going into Azure DevOps with bugs being reported, associated that with the bug being fixed, and seeing if they can actually detect how to fix bugs based on data that's coming out of your source code. And so they can not only do IntelliSense and sort of say, hey, go ahead and this is the member we're going to show you, but can they see patterns that then tend to lead towards defects and say, hey, this would be a refactoring, fix this because it's most likely a bug, but it's much more generated by machine learning than a foreknowledge of what the problem is. So that's an interesting thing that's happened there. The other things you start to sort of notice, you'll start to see features appear. So here, it's got the 3 dots, which means, hey, this is really minor. It's not a big deal. Don't freak out. But hey, we've got a suggestion here. You've gone and assigned a variable, and we don't see the point because you're not using this variable anyway. So why not go ahead and use C# 7 syntax and just discard it, or C# 8 syntax, just discard that entirely. And it gives me the ability to assign datetime now to underscore, which means I do run the property in this case, do run datetime now, but do nothing with it because there's no point in assigning it. You never use what it's assigned to. And so you start to see, in the IntelliSense, the ability for C# 8 and C# 7 features to start relate in terms of what you want to do. Here, you'll notice there's another one here. I'm going ahead and I've gone ahead and assigned string name to be null. Anyone know why it's surprising that there's no IntelliSense on this saying, hey, that's a problem? Anyone know why it should be a problem? It's not a trick question. Yes. Oh, great. This is great. We're gonna go have Austin tell us what the reason for this is. Austin happens to be in a C# class. I won't mention any of the teachers, but I happen to know, I have inside knowledge. Austin. Yes, yes. So it turns out that in C# 8, by default, a string type that is not decorated with a null ability operator is not null. It should not be null. And yet the compiler here is not warning, and you'll notice there's no warnings appearing at the bottom. So even though string is supposedly not null, and I'm assigning null, the compiler is saying no big deal. That's not a problem. It's totally okay. And it turns out that if Microsoft went and took all your existing code and changed all your reference types to by default be not null, that would break a lot of people's compilers. There would a lot of areas being showing up. Many of you are very disciplined and you've gone through and you said warnings. If a warning shows up, that's an error. That's a good thing. I congratulate you. But if you did that and suddenly we assigned null and a warning showed up, your build would break, your compile would break, and you'd probably have thousands and thousands of warnings of existing code that has been running in production. And it turns out you have to explicitly turn on this null ability feature. So when I said by default, your null reference types are not nullable unless you decorate them with the question mark, it's actually not default unless you tell the compiler that, hey, you want to opt into this feature. So it's by default if you've opted in, but if you haven't opted in, then it's not by default. And since I'm in Visual Studio 2019, you'd think there's some nice dialogue. I would just sort of right-click on the properties of my project, and I could just go specify, hey, null ability should be turned on. And it turns out there's actually no UI element for turning on null ability. The C# team is one team at Microsoft, and the Visual Studio team is another team at Microsoft, and the C# team was working very hard at making sure this null ability thing was working well, and it's just the way you want to work. And the Visual Studio team was adding a whole bunch of features, and they didn't sort of connect about, hey, there's this fundamental C# 8 feature, and so you have to go make some changes on your own. Without a UI. The obvious one is to do a pound nullable and enable, and you can do that, and then everything below that line is going to be enabled for if you go do that. But since this talk is not about C# 8, you would actually go into the CS proj file, and fortunately, to go in the CS proj file, it's not a big operation. You just double-click on the project, and it opens up the CS proj file. I know this seems extremely trivial, and I'm going to do this so many times because you're like, why didn't it do that since Visual Studio 2001, right? 2003. Why did we not have, well, we didn't. And now it's just there. So you double click, you can open up your project, and then you can go ahead and you can add your nullability features. So I can go and say nullable here. And you can enable. And then you get that, and when I save that, and I go back to my program, unless I misspelt it, which I didn't mean to. It's going to give me another warning. It's saying, hey, you've turned on nullable, but you didn't specify which version of C# you'd like to be using. Value for enable. So you can go and actually specify the language version in here, and you can go and specify lang version 8.0, and then go back. And both of those settings you have to go do without, that's not what I meant to do, without UI support and sort of helping you do that. Now it turns out that nullable feature 1, it actually depends on which framework you're using. So if you go and specify here, you got Net Standard 2.0, Net Standard, wow, 2.1. then you automatically are able to start doing C# 8 stuff, and you don't need this line here. Net standard. Fortunately, I'm pair programming, and you guys are actually helpful. This is good. So you don't need to actually specify, but nullable, no matter what, you have to opt into. So you have to go specify for nullable that's a feature you want to go ahead and turn on and have available to you. Okay, I'm going to keep going. You'll notice now there's now a squiggle underneath here, and I can do a control period, and it's now going to warn me, hey, if you're going to go and assign null to a non-nullable data reference type, because there's no question mark in front of it, then you should probably consider changing it to go put a question mark in. And you'll notice it then props up with the preview feature of sort of what that is. For those of you who didn't see me, I did control period. So it's well and familiar with everyone. Control period is the keyboard shortcut to get that IntelliSense. Pops up and says, hey, declare null as nullable. But you'll notice there's something really interesting about this. Right here, I get to specify whether I want to make the change right here on this line. I just hit enter. Or I can actually choose to fix the same problem in the entire document, or the entire project, or the entire solution. So if you've got tons and tons of code, you could, and I want to emphasize this, you could decide to change all of your code willy-nilly to be question mark. Now, just to repeat yes, this would be a great, the advice from the audience here, the advice from the audience is this would be a great thing to do on a Friday afternoon, just as you're about to leave on vacation for a couple of weeks. This would be sure that you'll be quite popular during the time that you're gone. Or at least people would think about you lots, so that's for sure. So what's interesting about the choice, and I want to be careful here, it consistently gives you the choice to make this change. And we can work through the implications. Let's look at another one that's here. I've gone ahead and done we've got one here. That's not the one I was looking for. Let's see here. You'll notice here, there's one that is simply correcting the formatting. And you could make a choice, right? This is very minor. It's just going to go ahead and remove the space. And you could go, hey, that seems reasonable. I'd like to go make that change for my entire project. Let's go ahead and apply that. So it's not that they don't apply. It's that there is the possibility of doing it over the case. And sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. But be aware, presumably you're running source code control. And if you decide to do this over your entire solution, your solution's just a mere 343.9 projects, it might have an effect on a lot of files that you might want to be, consider what the impact might be. Just hypothetically speaking. You'll notice that as this happens, I am actually getting warnings here. Some of these things pop out as sort of, hey, these are IDE advice, and they're just going to show up in the IDE. They're not actually going to show up in the command line. If I go to the command line and I do a .NET build, the IDE warnings aren't going to appear there. They're just going to appear here as CS warnings themselves. A couple others to be aware of. Some of the larger things you could do here. So you can go to an if statement here, and I can do a dot operator. And I can actually go convert the if to invert it. So I can actually go ask the opposite, and I can invert the if statement fairly quickly. That's an interesting way to go. I could have converted to a switch, because maybe that's more appropriate. So these are fairly complex operations that you might want to go ahead and do in terms of your changing your code or refactoring out your code. You can do things like go to your base classes. This was available in earlier versions of Visual Studio, like Visual Studio 2010 used to allow you to sort of refactor methods out, refactor methods out into base classes, and that now is possible inside Visual Studio 2. You can go extract method outs into base classes and things like that. Okay, questions before I keep going. Any questions? Okay. So a bunch of stuff that you can do inside the UI, inside your... I'm just going back to my program. I've talked about the style formatting, and I've mentioned that you can go ahead and fix this either the document level, the project level, the solution level. So you want to be aware of those kinds of things. There's a bunch of warnings just related to language improvements. So here's an improvement where you're doing string.format. So you go to your string.format code. Let's see if I got some. And you can go ahead and right-click on the format method. And it'll go say, hey, do you want to go convert this to interpolated string because it's easier to read? And assuming you're not doing localization, that would be a great move to make. It makes the code much more understandable. And you should kind of capitalize on those opportunities. CS project level rename. So again, this is the same thing with the double click where like, why didn't we have that a long time ago? It turns out you can rename stuff. And if you decide to rename your application, so if I go do this, F2 to do that, and I change this to application, and I hit enter, then in the past, I had to go ahead and open up the properties file, look at the properties of that project, and then I have to go make sure I update the namespace inside the application to match, oh, wow, look at that. They actually took the time to take the project name and render it inside the assembly name and the default namespace. So when I created a new file, it actually used the name of my project. It's remarkable. I mean, this is truly, I'd like to have a can for this. This is remarkable. Yeah. And what's interesting about this one is it made the change, but it's actually not gone ahead and updated my CS proj file. My CS proj file is exactly what it was, which means it's actually calculating the value of what should be in that dialog from the name of your project file. It's, again, quite phenomenal. But if you decide you want to override it, you could, of course, go change the settings, and then it'll embed additional property groups, property values inside your MS build. I'm going to go ahead and change that back. One thing to note before I change it, you'll notice that because I made that change, it doesn't go update all my namespaces. So my namespace here is still sample app. It doesn't change the source code. It just changes the project file and how the project file renders inside Visual Studio. It's not going to go through all your source code. You change the project name, and now it's going to have to update 1,000 files because you've got a bunch. So it's not going and doing that to go do that rename. But you can do a rename inside Visual Studio. So here it knows. In this case, hey, you've changed your application to be called this. Would you like me to go rename that namespace? And then it'll go ahead and do that throughout your project. Yes, question?
One thing that does affect, though, is like resource files.
Yes.
That leverage the default namespace.
Yes. So the comment was, one thing you should be concerned about is if you go change your project name and you're using the project name, the namespace within your resource files, it's not updating those. And again, the issue here is it's not making changes to source code when you change your project name. So all namespaces are still incorrect. I don't know the answer to this, but if you actually use rename refactoring, this right here, will it update the resource file when you do that? And I don't know the answer to that question. So I would hope it does, but I can't say for sure that would happen. As part of this, there is a Control RR feature that is new to 2019. So it can go to this. I can say Control RR, and it'll pop up and do the rename. So this is the rename feature and specifying how far you want to do rename. Again, I think we've been doing rename for a long time. I don't see this as particularly revolutionary. But you can do that in such a way that it's prompting you, hey, do you want to go through this rename? And what do you want to go apply that change to? I tend, personally, to make the rename in the source code and then do a control period for it to go percolate that through the other spaces. So rather than me going doing Control RR, I tend to do it by changing the name and then using refactoring to go make the modification. But each to your own. Yeah, that's good. Another new feature that you no doubt have started to discover is that there's actually now an indicator of where your source code's at in terms of how good it is or what's going on. And it appears in multiple places. Right now down here you're seeing, hey, there's a couple warnings you might want to be paying attention to, and you can jump between those warnings using the arrow keys, Control L page down, and to go navigate between those different warnings that are within your source code. And that's a great way to know those shortcuts. Number one, I just like the fact that it reminds me what the shortcut is. But number two, you can go sort of page through them and make those changes. While I'm here, I'll show you one before jumping back to slides. There's a new drop-down here for code cleanup. Control K, Control E is code cleanup. And you can configure what the code cleanup does. So for example, here you can go apply implicit, explicit type preferences and a whole bunch of add accessibility modifiers, those kinds of things. Now, you would think that this would be extensible, and it will be, but it's not right now. So this is the list you have available, and you can associate which ones should be associated with which profile you want to go and execute on your code cleanup. And again, I'll go ahead and clean up that entire document to match whatever the feature you chose to do. And it is configurable, but you cannot add to the available fixtures list yet. But for sure, that's going to be added. And I would imagine it's going to work off some of the FX-cop code analyzer kind of infrastructure that we've started to see emerge recently with code analyzers. Questions about that or anything? Okay, so you get to do your code cleanup right here. You can configure it. You can go ahead and run it. This will go ahead and run it for the entire file. You can operate through, and you can sort of see the health of your file by looking at your errors and your warning count right from the document window. Code cleanup, we did about that. Here's a great one. So I don't know if you guys are aware, but if you do Control-Shift-V, it actually prompts you. I'll bet I get copy a bunch of stuff. So I can copy the null there. Hello. I can copy a string here. And then I can do Control-Shift-V, and it prompts me with that sort of clipboard history. Has anyone used this? A couple people. So I tend to have no longer use this because it's available with Windows. If you do Windows V, it does throughout all your applications. You get history, clipboard history. So it sort of was a feature that emerged in Visual Studio because Windows didn't provide it. But now that Windows provides it, I'm not sure that there's much advantage in Visual Studio providing it. Maybe it doesn't work on a Mac. I don't know. But I tend to use the Windows version of this rather than the Visual Studio version because that allows me to work between applications as well. By the way, this is a feature you have to turn on in Windows. So it's very trivial to turn on. You can just go clipboard history. But by default, when you install Windows 10, clipboard history is not on, which is probably a good thing if you aren't aware that's keeping track of your passwords and everything else like that. It's probably good to know that, hey, that's not something you want. But you can turn it on, and once it's turned on, it works between applications. So Windows V tends to be my default go-to for clipboard ring or clipboard history. There's a new search feature that's kind of interesting. So if I go ahead and run this, so I'm going to do an F5 for debug. I don't know if the application was compiling. I didn't look, but oh, I got the 0 here, so I guess it compiles. So I'm running the project. Okay, so we got there. So what's interesting here, as I can go in, today is Wednesday, and I can hit enter on my search, and it's actually going through search at all the variables that it has access to in the debugger, and it'll go pop up that variable and find, hey, which one has that value. So now I'm actually able to search through all memory that's within the application is running, and I can go ahead and find those values. So it seems like a really minor feature, but this is incredibly efficient in terms of finding data that you know, in particular, that you're looking for. And so in this case, I look for Wednesday. I happen to have had a date time that I'm not doing anything with, but it did assign it to date time. And so now when I go look for that, I actually pull up Wednesday. And it's actually navigating through the hierarchy of the data and pulling out properties of whatever is accessible in either autos or watch windows or locals. Is anything available in that space? So if you haven't seen that, that's a cool addition to that. We've done a little bit of null conversation here. It's invalid to do this on main. It turns out with main, args is not going to be null, assuming you're getting the value from the command line. If you're calling this from a test project, then args, of course, you could go do bad things. You could pass null. But if you're passing null from the command line, it's not going to be null. But it turns out you can refactor this, and you can actually add a null check automatically just using that dot period operator. So now as your values come in, you can check them. So here's the interesting question to ask. You'll notice my array here is declared as a string bracket bracket. Is it nullable? Nullability is turned on. Could args be null? Ignoring that this is main, because that's a corner case. Imagine this is a different method. Could the value of args be null given the fact that this is not a string bracket bracket question mark? So nullability is turned on. All null reference types are non-nullable unless they're decorated with a question mark. There's no question mark here. Could args be null? Yes. Turns out, absolutely. Absolutely. The Null Ability feature in C# 8 only expresses your intent. It does not control whoever calls you. They could not have turned on the Null Ability feature. They could have turned it on and ignored the warning. They could have decided, what the heck, I'm going to override it and use a null forgiving operator and explicitly call null. There is nothing in the source code that actually checks or changes the semantic behavior of the way your source code executes. And so the fact that now inside main, I can go automatically do a check that is still absolutely a check I need to make, because I don't know if the people calling me are actually paying attention to any of the warnings that would have cropped up. So it is a nullable reference types only allows you to express the intent of your encode. It does not actually do any semantic changes to verify that you don't have null. So the fact that now I can do a control period, do refactoring, and add a null check is a really good thing, except in the case of main, because main is called by the runtime, and the runtime won't ever pass a null into this particular check. So that's the one exception. But even though it's a non-nullable data type, you still need to check for null in general, even if you have that. Improved search. So what's really interesting here, I can now go Control Q, and I can type Android. Just what you guys were thinking about doing. And what's interesting about this is you'll notice that the extent to which the search behaves, it now isn't just looking at what are the features or what are the menus available. It's actually going into things like what is available in the installer. So that search capability is now expanding on a huge set of resources that are available and indexing all those to this point now that I went and typed Android. It says, oh, would you like to install the Android SDK? It's kind of like when you worked with Clippy in Microsoft Word and it said, hey, it looks like you're writing a letter. Same kind of thing, but this is a little bit different because it's for developers. While I'm there, I should point out that if you go into search, which I happen to have done here, and you go and do modify, first of all, your install, since we're talking about install, first of all, you can have side-by-side installs. And so what I like to do, I have a Visual Studio version 2019 that's clean, sort of version. I've never actually used it, but I feel like I have to install it just in case. And then you can have a preview version installed side-by-side, and they're completely different instances. And so that way you sort of have a pure pristine instance and a sort of bleeding edge instance. And then you can install 2017 as well. So you can have multiple installs side-by-side of Visual Studio, and they appropriately go in different directories to sort of match that. And you can upgrade them. So this morning, you'll notice there's an upgrade available. I just upgraded, but there's an upgrade date available here to preview 2.0, and you can go ahead and run that, and we'll just update that particular version. So you can even have multiple dot releases. So you'll notice here that 16.3.6, I could actually have another version of Visual Studio 16 installed. That's a different point release if I need to, because I'm working on 2 different projects for 2 different customers or whatever the deal is. The other thing about this, if I go ahead and modify, you'll notice the search is actually enabled here too. So I can go into individual components, and I can type Android, and it'll pull up all the Android particular items. So rather than me searching through this minute list of checkboxes, hey, what should I install? You can actually jump to and sort of say, I need this feature, I need Android or Azure, Android, Azure, same thing. And it'll go ahead and pull up all the Azure tools related to that. While I'm here, I will also mention to you that Visual Studio does install the Azure PowerShell module. The Azure PowerShell module has been updated to the AZ module, and those are not compatible with each other. You can't install them both at the same time without some extreme trickery. So you want to be sensitive to what you're installing, because even though Visual Studio has recently come out, it does bundle the Azure PowerShell module, and Azure PowerShell module is somewhat out of date now with the AZ PowerShell module. And so be careful what you install related to PowerShell development, because that one happens to be updated. Okay, back into Visual Studio. We'll go back to my slides. I've talked about search. It's going to go ahead and search settings, command, install options. Phil demonstrated this earlier. If you go to Control Q and you go ahead and type theme, you can go ahead and change your color themes to be dark or light or whatever you happen to go want, which itself is actually a Visual Studio 2019 feature to go specify which one you want. It turns out that developers seem to rate the quality of the developer by how dark the screen is. So the darker your screen and the more of a developer you like, unless, of course, you happen to be presenting. If you're presenting, or even if you're projecting onto a monitor in a conference room, you have to use light. And if you're not aware of that fact, then clearly you're ignorant. So you have to make sure when you present, you choose to use light settings. And then when you're on your own screen, you have to use dark, because then you're not as good otherwise. So just to make sure we're clear on how status is established between developers. Yeah, it's Phil. I wasn't picking on Phil. It didn't even occur to me actually about that. Yeah, that was completely. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. Okay. Yeah, exactly. And you'll note, just to be clear, I was so excited about the fact that you could have dark that I went and did all my screenshots with dark, and it turns out that PowerPoint doesn't have like a control Q, change from light to dark. It's actually like a bitmap image, and so I'd have to go redo all of them, and forget it. I'm not doing that. So I didn't want to do that. Where was I? Where's my presentation? I just jumped out of my presentation. So there's a navigation between constructs, which I have very few of right now, so I haven't derived from anything. But you could go ahead and right-click here to go ahead and do jumps between implementations and things like that. And there's actually keyboard shortcuts. I'm very much a keyboard type person, so I just love the fact that when I forget, I can use this just to prompt me about which keyboard shortcuts to go use. To go jump to the definition, stuff like that. I think this is another one of those, hey, how good are you kind of programming, because it really allows you to navigate between around your source code is to know those. So I would memorize those keyboard shortcuts and jump between them to go use that. Performance loading. So I've got a project here that's got a little bit of stuff in it. Let me see. There's a new window when you start up. So when you start Visual Studio, you can have a start window that prompts you and prompts you up and says, hey, these are all the projects you happen to be working with. Do you want to go clone another project? It actually allows you to clone out of a source code control, open a new solution that isn't mentioned. But you'll notice if you go and open up a relatively large project like this one, do I want to save? Sure, what the heck? I don't know. As it's loading, it takes a little bit of time to do that. Actually, I think in this case I'm unloading. And then once it starts to get the project files read in, it then starts to load all the data asynchronously, and such that this is taking longer than I would like. This is my third instance of Visual Studio, which is not recommended. And I'm running on battery. And you'll notice right here, it says, hey, this project's loading in the background. Do you want to ignore this or whatever? So it actually continues to go ahead and load while you're operating. And so that load should be taken faster than it would have in the past. I'm going to switch back to my previous solution, start window, and we'll go back to. That's a good point. So the extensions that you install are also asynchronous inside Visual Studio. So you're not waiting for the extensions to all load before you can start working. And the other thing is it remembers the last place you're working in a solution, assuming you kept your user files. It remembers the last place you're working and load those files first. So you can actually actively start editing and working within those files rather than waiting for the entire project to work and then start editing. Thanks for that. Solution filters. I don't know if you guys have seen this. So I can actually unload. So again, not that you guys would only work with sample projects, but if you actually do real work, you probably have more than 2 projects in your solution. And so you can actually right-click on a project. Let's go right-click on the test one here. And I can go and unload that project. And then I can right-click on my solution. And you'll notice down at the bottom here, there's now a Save as Solution filter option. And that allowed me to actually save an SLFN file, so save as solution filter. It props up, asks you what your name you want to call it. And you'll notice there's extensions there, SLNF, and that allows you to save which projects were actually loaded, and then you can reload the SLNF file, and it'll only load those projects. So if you have large projects, for example, you might be saying, hey, I only work on the front end. I want to just load the projects related to the front end, and I don't want to do database projects and middle tier projects. You could just do a subset. What I've seen people frequently do is they go create multiple solution files. They have a solution file for the front end, and a solution file for the middle tier, and a solution file for the database, and then they go back to the command line, they type .NET build, and build goes, which of the 10 solution files would you like me to build? And so this allows you to specifically use an SLNF file. Unfortunately, at this time, they're not actually the .NET command line doesn't read these files, so you can't build an SLNF file at this time. That's not a feature that's possible.
Just as an aside, my favorite way to use it is to not care about what projects are related. Instead, unload everything, load one, and then say load dependency.
Yes.
And then it figures out, based on the dependency graph, which projects it should load.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. So what Kelly said, the way he likes to do it is to unload all projects and then find the one project that he wants to work with and right-click on that one and then say load dependencies. And the load dependency option right here goes ahead. The load dependency options will make sure that only the dependency projects for what you're working with will get loaded. And so you can be quite efficient in the way you work. Thank you for mentioning that. The question was, is there an easy way to switch between filters? And the only way I know is to go ahead and load up a different file. They do load from the command line, so you can go specify the filter file rather than the solution file. You can do that. Docker support. So this has actually been available for quite a while, and it's getting easier and easier to go do Docker-related stuff. You can right-click on a project and go to Add, and you can go ahead and add your Docker support. What's interesting about this now is that previously, if you hadn't got Docker installed, it would say, hey, Docker's not installed. Now it prompts you, hey, would you like us to just take care of that for you? And it'll go ahead and install Docker, and it'll tell you to go ahead and reboot your machine so you can turn on Hyper-V and whatever, those kinds of things that have to be enabled. It's not Hyper-V, but basically emulation mode. It needs to be turned on. So it takes care of trying to get that all set up for you rather than having you go search, okay, now what do I need to install, what I need to do. The Docker support will do that. And then once Docker's installed, when you go ahead and do debug, it'll launch in a Docker container and allow you to debug in that Docker container the operation of your file running in that context. So it actually debugs essentially cross-platform into the other OS or the other computer and starts to allow you to work in that context. Yes, Austin.
Yeah, the practice solution filter, is that kind of like an alias? Like if you're working on a project in the solution filter, is it actually changing the code in that original solution?
So the question file, is it an alias such if you actually make a change to the solution file, is it changing, if you make a change to the solution filter, is it changing the solution file? And the answer is no. A solution filter just specifies which things in the solution will get loaded, and you can only work with those items in the solution. It doesn't make a change that if you remove something from the solution filter, does it not get loaded in the solution file? The answer is no. And furthermore, you can still see the projects that are in the solution. They're just not loaded. So it just reduces your, it increases your performance basically and narrows the scope of what you have to worry about. I'm a little biased, but this is actually one of my favorite features to talk about the Test Explorer. Test Explorer in previous versions was getting very long in the tooth, fairly painful. It hadn't had significant upgrades, and I'm excited about what's now available in the Test Explorer. So the whole UI has been rewritten over testing. Whether you're working with MS Test or XUnit or NUnit, it doesn't really matter. It works across all the same. But there's a bunch of new UI features that are available. To start, you'll notice that there's a settings here. Click the drop down. And in here, you'll notice that there's an option to run tests after build. So the idea is we want to move the discovery of errors as close to development time as possible. And if we go ahead and check the checkbox that says run tests after build, essentially when we build, it automatically goes and starts running your unit tests. And as a result, you start to get reports about your unit tests failing almost instantaneously after you do a build. And so that's a feature that I almost always go turn on. This is not an enterprise feature, so you don't have to have enterprise installed. So there's live unit testing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But just to go get testing running, there's a run tests after build feature. And then the other thing you'll notice, it keeps the, in this case, VS Test Console running. So instead of restarting that process, it keeps it running to go and get your test to execute faster. That said, on occasion, you will find that it leaves that process around and it holds on to files that you don't want to have held onto. And in that case, you need to go to the command line and actually kill that process. You can do that with Visual Studio running, and it'll just restart the process. So that works fairly cleanly. The other thing that's interesting, I'm not going to reproduce it right now, but if it tries to write, if the compiler tries to write to a file, and the file is in use, so let's say it's your DLL is still in use, so the test project has still got it loaded, it actually gives you the PID, the process ID, for that, for whatever file is holding on, whatever process is holding onto that file, which means you can go to the command line or wherever you go do stuff to delete processes. As far as I know, there's only a command line, but there's probably other ways I don't know about. So I would go to the command line. You can go ahead and type kill and the name of the process ID, and it'll go ahead and kill that. Or if you really want to make sure, you can use sort of a PS kill or something like that to go kill that process. And Visual Studio handles that restart no problem. It just continues to execute and all goes well. So the other feature that in here to be aware of is there's run tests in parallel, which allow you to get your tests executing significantly faster than they were in the past. The thing to be cognizant of here is that running tests in parallel means you can't be sharing any test data between your projects. For obvious reasons, it's going to modify that data. And so it should start to prompt you at this point to, as you start to create more unit tests, whenever you create a new test class, think very carefully or avoid, as much as possible, avoid having tests that would collide with each other if they happen to be running at the same time. So don't reuse file names, things like that, because you're going to end up with problems. And work hard to design your tests so parallel is supported. And it's non-trivial, just to be clear. Things like, oh, I loaded a config file, I wanted to make sure I wrote to the config file correctly. Let's write 3 tests that write to the config file. Well, if the config file is actually a config file and not a mock, then you're just preventing yourself from running in parallel, and the errors you're going to back is like access denied errors, and they're going to be a pain to work through and trying to figure that out. But where possible, think carefully in your test design, how do I enable the ability to run tests in parallel? Another feature that we've been waiting for with .NET Core that's been finding pretty difficult to get enabled is that we can now run Analyse code coverage for all tests, and this is not limited to an enterprise feature in Visual Studio. This is simply a reference. So you simply need reference assembly and you get it. And it's actually referenced for you automatically when you create a new project. So if you go on the command line or in Visual Studio, you do .NET new and you type MS test for the template, it will go ahead and add a test, an assembly to your project called coverlet. Sorry. That was not my test project. And so it goes ahead and adds coverlet to your project. And now you can go ahead and get code coverage of your project. And the UI within Visual Studio will go ahead and take a look at that. So now I can actually go to Analyze code coverage against my project. And then I will get the UI such I can see which parts of my process are actually executed by my tests or not. It gives you the output we used to see exclusively in... it's still running. Exclusively used to see this in Enterprise, but now it's available with just standard versions of Visual Studio. Waiting, sorry. So here's my code coverage report. And you can go and specify sort of where you want to drill into. And then once you find something that you want to pay attention to, you can actually go then double click on it. And you'll notice here, hey, I didn't write a test that passed null into main.args. This might be a place I want to go ahead and add tests to verify the capability. And so code coverage is included. And it's more than just a percentage report. By the way, the percentage report is not based on lines. It's based on blocks. Thank goodness. That's a good thing. It's based on blocks. So you can sort of focus in where do I want to go ahead and add my tests. And when you got code coverage enabled, it also shows up inside Azure DevOps. So you can get sort of results coming out of that. And there's also an option in Azure DevOps to actually say things like, automatically, if my code coverage drops, then reject the build. So you can start, presumably you're going to start more than 0. As soon as you got more than 0 code coverage, you can actually check that checkbox, and it's literally just checking a checkbox. You can check the checkbox in Azure DevOps and make sure that all new code coming in is actually got unit tests associated with it, so your code coverage doesn't drop. This is really important because sometimes we're overwhelmed by writing unit tests for existing code. Brownfield world, we didn't know about writing 2 unit tests. We now hear it's the best thing since Swiss cheese, and we're like, I just overwhelmed, it's way too much work. But if we have a build task that says just make sure you're keeping it the same or going higher, then you can always make sure that you're improving your code as you go. So it's just this minor little checkbox that you're like, nobody thinks about, but I think it can make a significant impact on improving your code without a lot of work. I think I've showed you all the features. And oh, there's one more keyboard shortcut that, as far as I recall, didn't exist before. You can now do, if you go into your test, let me just open a test. You can do Control RL. Let me be clear. Control L, lift your hands off the keyboard. Control R, lift your hands off your keyboard. L will run your last set of tests. So if you're working, you've got a test working, and then you go into your production project, you make a modification, you're like, okay, now rerun that test. Control RL will rerun that, and so you can just keep re-executing that test over as you modify your code and keep going. And so it's a keyboard shortcut that I love to have, rather than navigating back to the Test Explorer window or navigating back to the test and pushing Control RT. You can just rerun the last set with Control RL to get that test running. Yes?
Control RD will do the same, but under debug.
Control RD will do the same under debug, or Control R, Control L will do the same thing if you want to do it under debug, I believe. In all, I believe it's pretty consistent. I might be a little bit off. I, of course, write perfect code, so I don't need a debug, but I've heard that debugging is relevant for other people. So the way the keyboard shortcut works is if you use Control R and then hands off keyboard T, that's a run operation, and it will run the context of the test you're currently in. If you're in one test, it runs one test. If you're in a class and not in a particular method, it will run all the tests in that class. If you use Control R, Control T, it will do the same thing, but in debug mode. So this gentleman said here you can use Control D for debug. I use, because I try and map the same keyboard shortcuts, just using the Control key twice will give you the debug operation automatically in that context. So it's just my memory, the way my memory works. Not very well, but that's how it works. Okay, I talked about code coverage. We've already talked about this to get an update on that. There's a new create project dialog. So file, new project. This was really long in the teeth in earlier versions because we would have like framework versions referenced when we were taking .NET projects. I mean, it was fairly nasty. At this point now, I can go in here. I can type .NET. I can type core, and it'll go ahead and filter out. I didn't mean to push enter back. I can type core, and it'll go ahead and filter down just to the core type projects that you want to go work with, and you can specify core or type other things to go do the search. And it remembers your filter. You'll notice that when I went back, it still had the same filter active. Thank you, Kelly.
Between project creation.
Yes.
So if you pick CSharp, the next time you start up Visual Studio and you publish project, you won't see Visual Basic.
So Kelly's point is that it remembers which filters you had. So if you went ahead and specified some filters inside the project, it'll remember those between executions of Visual Studio. It continues to remember. So it basically, it's using your preferences and continue to limit it by those. So here you can do project types or whatever and remember those filters. I already talked about the start window, code analysis. So code analysis is kind of still in a strange point right now. So let's just sort of be real about doing code analysis. First of all, you will be prompted by Visual Studio to install the Vizix package, and I would recommend you don't do that. It's actually related to some UI features that won't then render on the command line. And so it'll do code analysis, but it won't work in the command line and won't work in your DevOps build or in your build system. And so I would actually suggest you don't install the Vizix. Instead, what you want to do is go ahead and install the code analysis packages. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on here and do Manage NuGet Packages. And I'm going to go do a browse. And I'm going to type fxcop using the old name. Whoops, I should do an fx. So I would choose this one in terms of your code analysis. This will install some default rules. This one also has dependencies on other ones. So rather than installing the individual other ones, it goes ahead and has a bunch of dependencies it installs for you. So rather than installing individually, you can go and install this Microsoft Code Analysis FX Cup analyzers. Be careful here when you type analyzers. So if you type code analyzers here, code analysis, let's try that. There's, oh, yeah. It searches and finds a whole bunch, but read through the help because sometimes it says, that's a good one. That's It basically says frequently this is intended for people writing code analyzers or something like that. So be sure the ones you install are actually tended to be that type. I'm going to time conscious. Is that with Chris or without questions?
You're past, 2 minutes till.
Got it. Thank you. So install your code analyzers, and then you will. And then you start getting warnings for your code that you can use the control period to go ahead and deal with those warnings. I think this is the easiest thing to do to improve your code the fastest because it just tells you, hey, you're doing some bad stuff, and you learn a ton by just analyzing the warnings you're getting and how to process those. I spend more time, but don't have it. There's an experimental. You can actually turn on an experimental VS Terminal feature. Again, Control-Q to do the search. Type experimental or type terminal. This dialog pops up. You can check it. It's a PowerShell terminal. It's embedded inside Visual Studio. There's a bunch of .NET Core updates. Grant will handle all of those, and you'll be way more excited about that. There's a bunch of pull requests that you can get inside Visual Studio now. And so the improvement of interacting with Git is significantly better. And so you can actually process pull requests from Visual Studio. You'll notice you can also start to do things like emojicons in your source code. I know this is something you've been desperate to do. So Windows period, obviously, Windows period used throughout the entire operating system, pops up your emojicons, and you can now embed those in source code because it's Unicode. Why not? I mean, definitely. So you can actually do that as part of your pull requests and your approvals and things like that. Talked about this one. Time travel debugging. There's now time travel debugging. This is for unmanaged code. So if you run WinDebug, I think I might have it running already. Nope, and we don't have time. But if you run WinDebug, so WINDBG, it'll launch a time travel debugging that allow you to do time travel debugging for unmanaged code on your machine, such that it'll save the entire dump of the file, and you can go back after the fact and actually run that code. So that's a great feature if you're having a hard-to-find bug or cannot reproduce bug. That's good to know about. There's a developer PowerShell. I'll just show you that. Developer PowerShell preview. Right now, this is kind of boring. Do I have it open? Nope. Just quickly show you there's, oh, come on. So you'll notice there's a bunch of modules here. The one that you're looking at that's being developed right now is this one. So get-command-module, right-click that. It's only got 2 things, which basically sets up your environment so you can do stuff from the command line. But there's a future to this. Kelly has a blog post about it. You can read about all the information about how to debug this. So.
A PowerShell module that does the same thing that the batch files did in the original, like developer command prompts that like load up, make MS build stuff like that.
Yep. So it's a PowerShell module that does what you used to be able to do with the batch file for starting dev. Live unit testing, IntelliCode, a bunch of stuff there. And last thing, if you want the slides, they're available here. Grant will publish this as well, so you have access to this URL. But if you want to download styles or download sample code, that's where you're going to go ahead and get it from. Question?
Any of the features that you showed are enterprise only?
No, I did not show any enterprise-only features until those last 3 slides, which I didn't show because I ran out of time. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you coming and joining us.